Okay, we are going to get started. We have 88 participants so far in the chat. This is so exciting. And we again welcome you all to our CDBG-DR program overview. The whole focus is getting you all ready for grant submission. I am Ayana Wallace with the Division of Community Revitalization. I currently serve as the director of the Community Infrastructure Program. And again, thank you all for being here. Rebecca, can you proceed to the next slide, please? Very quickly, I would like to share with you all the purpose of this session. This session is assessing readiness. So it's session one of a 3-session series. Today, we will be informing, assessing the readiness of potential projects, as well as potential applicants, talking about very high-level implementation requirements, policies, procedures, and getting you all up to speed on CDBG-DR grant requirements. During this session, the state, which is DCR, will conduct assessments throughout the presentation. There will be 3 or 4 polls that we're asking for you all to participate in. These polls will allow us to gather information so that we can help create technical assistance plans for you all. Again, this session is for planning, information sharing, and identifying technical assistance needs. And I have a stop sign there. That stop sign is very important because we don't want anyone to leave this session thinking that we are asking you to make project limiting decisions, meaning the information that you are gaining today should not drive you out to buy land, move land, commit to any project designs. It is only for information, assessment, and preparation. Our getting ready phase, which you see in yellow, will be 3 in-person meetings. Will actually be 2 in-person meetings in 3 different locations. We will be providing those locations and the opportunity to register for those sessions. Session 2 will take place the week of August the 12th through the 14th. During that time, we will be focusing more on pre-application tasks and documentation. Some of the topics we will be talking about are your environmental review requirements, those policies and procedures that your team needs to start thinking about, adhering to 2 CFR procurement, public hearings, and a lot more. Then session 3, again, which will be in person in September. This session will focus on post-application project implementation and performance. Getting into October, we will be hosting or participating in one-on-one technical assistance sessions, as well as the pre-application conference. Again, this is a 3-part series. I think it will be extremely beneficial to all entities if you believe that you will be applying for these funds. All right, next. House rules. Please place all questions, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little box that says Q&A. Please place all of your questions in that Q&A. This is very important because it will allow us to keep track of the questions and the answers with the intention of sending out a document towards the end of the week with all of the questions for everyone's use. In addition, this session is being recorded. It will be linked to our Helene Recovery website sometime today or later this week. So those are our housekeeping rules. Again, all questions in the Q&A. And I would like to quickly thank all of our collaborators. This session, this whole series has been brought together by stakeholders of DCR, the School of Government, as well as the League, the Association of County Commissioners, as well as your COGS, and ICF, who serves as a consultant for DCR. Today, Ms. Rebecca Badgett will be facilitating this session, and I am going to turn it over to her. Thank you all again for being in attendance.
Thank you, Ayanna. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about the CDBG-DR grant. As Ayanna mentioned, I am Rebecca Badgett. I'm a faculty member at the UNC School of Government. I work in grants management and compliance, primarily in local government finance. Now, all of you got the ARPA fund, so you might have seen me with Kara Malanzi helping you work through that grant program. So today we're going to sort of shift gears and talk about another source of federal funding, the disaster recovery grants. There's going to be a lot of information shared today, and there might be at some point more questions than answers that we have. The Department of Commerce is still working to develop many of the programs that these funds can be spent on. So we don't know all of the answers and how specific funds can be spent to meet specific project needs. But the goal really is to provide you with a bigger picture overview of this grant program and what to be thinking about as things start coming down the line at you. So today we're going to really dig into what the CDBG-DR program is, some of the program requirements and federal laws that govern that federal program. Then we're going to talk about eligible projects at a high level, what types of projects might be eligible once you receive the funding or once you apply for the funding. We're going to look at some sample projects, what has been done with these types of funds before. And then we're just going to give you a couple of key considerations and next steps to think about as you leave this webinar, some key takeaways that might be important to remember. So as Ayanna mentioned, we are going to have some future trainings. There's the future training in August that's about the project application process. And then September, we're going to dig into those compliance requirements at a little more in-depth level. You'll learn more about procurement and some of the other uniform guidance rules that are going to govern the management of this grant. Today, it's just a high-level overview of what is CDBG-DR and why are we here today and how are these funds going to help us in our recovery efforts. So let's get going. There's a lot of disaster recovery funding. I'm sorry that you all have had to become way more familiar with these types of disaster recovery funds than you would have otherwise wanted to be. Everyone probably has some level of familiarity with the FEMA Public Assistance Grant. And the FEMA Public Assistance Grants designed to restore you to your pre-disaster conditions, to make things whole as if they were before the disaster. Then there's other sort of variety of federal funding sources. You may or may not have this type of funding or applied for grants under these programs, but there's the Economic Development Administration, the EDA grants. USDA has certain federal grants available for disaster recovery. There are SRF loans from DEQ to support water and sewer resiliency. Today, we're really focusing on the last one in this line, CDBG-DR, it's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. And this block grant is focused on housing and infrastructure and economic development initiatives that are going to primarily benefit low and moderate income persons. The CDBG-DR is sort of the last line. It comes in and meets those unmet needs that the other grants don't cover. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means in the next slide. But it's your final area of funding, your final tranche of funds that can help you complete these projects that you may not otherwise have the funds to complete. So when you're thinking about why am I here today, big picture, I want you to have that sort of mindset of this is sort of an exciting opportunity for you to get to consider projects that you want to undertake, but couldn't do so without this extra funding source. So when there's a funding shortfall, these disaster recovery funds can help fill that gap. So think, what would we really want to do with this money based on what you're going to learn today? And how can this money help us restore and also get a little bit more resilient to future disasters? So put on your hat and be like, if I had a magic wand, what would I kind of want to spend these funds on, provided that they weren't within an eligible use? So the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program is administered by HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So when you hear me say HUD throughout this program, that's what I'm talking about. It's the federal government that runs the disaster recovery program. Many of you probably get Community Development Block Grant funds. And it's a very similar program to the CDBG program. It just has a disaster recovery element to it. So these funds are a flexible grant funding source to help communities like you recover from presidentially declared disasters. And the goal of the funding is to address unmet needs and promote long-term resiliency. Where is our funding shortfalls and how are we going to become more resilient after this disaster is the overall program goal. This block grant, the Disaster Recovery Block Grant, is very similar as far as how it's administered to the Community Development Block Grant. So you're going to see some parallels here with the rules that apply to just the CDBG program. We're also going to apply to the DR program too. But HUD has come up with, of course, some waivers and alternative requirements that aren't under the CDBG program. And those are set forth in the specific laws that govern this program, this specific disaster declaration. So you kind of go default, the CDBG-DR rules apply, but we always want to look to see what the modifications are or the waiver requirements specific to this disaster declaration. And I'm going to point out where some of those key laws are in a couple of slides. The eligible projects for the disaster recovery funding focus on housing, infrastructure, economic revitalization, and mitigation efforts to help you fill those mitigation funding gaps and get you to a more resilient spot. So all of the projects we're going to talk about today are going to fall into one of these categories: housing, infrastructure, and economic revitalization. These projects generally are supposed to be for the benefit of low and moderate income persons. The whole purpose of the CDBG grant is to benefit low and moderate income persons primarily. Same thing with the disaster recovery funding. What is low and moderate income? It's defined as households with incomes at or below 80% of the area median income, the AIM, or projects serving areas where 51% or more of the residents are low or moderate income persons. So we have household incomes or certain areas where the percentage of low and moderate income persons is fairly high. We want to tailor our projects to make sure we're meeting the needs of the low and moderate income people or areas. All right, so that's a high level overview of what this program means. We're going to do a poll because we're curious to know how many of you are fairly familiar with the CDBG program and how many of you are thinking this is completely new to me today. So if you don't mind, the league is going to launch this poll for me. Thank you. So we have, how familiar are you with the program? 1, not familiar. What is CDBG-DR? Somewhat familiar, but haven't identified potential projects. Somewhat familiar and have identified potential projects. Familiar and have shovel-ready projects in mind. Okay. Great. Looks like most of us fall in somewhere between the second and third category. You're fairly familiar, a little bit familiar. Some have some projects in mind. Some are kind of thinking through things. Only a couple of you are completely new to the program. And it looks like not too many of us have shovel-ready projects, which completely makes sense because even the program requirements haven't been fully announced. So you might just still be thinking about them at a high level. All right, and that poll. How did we get this money? That's a question you might be asking. Where does this one come from? There's a lot of federal funding, as we mentioned. How did we get here today? This funding was appropriated by Congress. So the CDBG-DR funds were appropriated by the United States Congress. They authorized in a bill to provide $12 billion disaster recovery funds to aid in recovery efforts for federally funded disasters that occurred in 2023 and 2024. So this $12 billion bill for disaster recovery isn't just for Hurricane Helene. So that anyone in the United States that had suffered a major disaster was possibly awarded funds for that disaster that declared in 2023 or 2024. And Hurricane Helene happened to fall into that timeline, so you got put into this public law. The public law is 118, 158, and that's the congressional law that says, okay, we're on board. We're going to support communities that suffered disasters by giving them some federal dollars to help recover. So that's the congressional level, how we got the funds authorized. Then HUD published the Universal Notice in the Federal Register on January 8th, 2025. And that's when the HUD comes in and says, okay, we have our basic CDBG-DR rules, but here are our specific alternative requirements, regulatory requirements, award processes, and what we're going to say are high-level eligible activities under this specific award. So they're like the rules of the road. After that, there was a Federal Register publication, and then basically the announcement appropriating the funding to specific jurisdictions that are entitled to a piece of this pie. So on January 16th, another announcement was published in the Federal Register saying, here's how we've appropriated funding. And guess what? As part of this $12 billion, North Carolina, you got $1.4 billion for Helene recovery efforts. And that's going to be divided up like this. 1.2 billion essentially is to meet those unmet recovery needs, just to help support the projects. And then about 86 million is going to be for mitigation efforts, how we're going to come in and make sure we're more resilient to future disasters. So we have two sort of tranches of money, the project side of things and the mitigation side of things. We're going to implement mitigation measures into some of our project funding. Asheville got a second, its own little tranche of money. They got 225 million themselves just to administer these funds. But otherwise, the state is in charge of administering the $1.4 billion pot of CDBG-DR funding. Asheville is going to sort of work with the state a little bit, but they are in charge of $225 million of these recovery funds. As you all know, we got a new president starting in January. So the Universal Notice that was published on January 8th with all those rules had a revision. There was a memo to sort of update to make sure that the program aligned with the presidential objectives. So this is called the revised Universal Notice. It was published in the Federal Register on March 20th. It was released on March 19th. And it's sort of the document that you should refer to when you want to go and read and make sure you have all the most up-to-date information. Now, it's not an easy read. I have it right here printed out. It's like 100, almost 200 pages, but it has a lot of great information about those alternative requirements, regulatory requirements, and the entire award process. So that's the most up-to-date version of the Universal Notice. And when you hear the term Universal Notice, it's just the term we use to describe the rules and regulations for this specific disaster, for the Helene disaster, for you particularly. All right, so where are we now? Let's talk about the process. How did we get here today? So we talked about that $1.4 billion the state got. Well, the state grantee is the North Carolina Department of Commerce. And within that, there's the Department of Resiliency that was formed to help specifically administer this grant fund. So when we talk about the grantee, it's the state as the North Carolina Department of Commerce. They get to choose how these funds are divvied up and how they're spent to meet these unmet recovery needs. So the states get awarded the funds, and then they have to draft an action plan. And that action plan contains an unmet needs assessment and a mitigation needs assessment. And it will also identify funding priorities and determine the programs that these funds are going to support. Part of this action plan, the state went out and talked to citizens. They did some analysis. Where are our greatest needs for recovery? And then they wrote up the whole action plan, kind of outlining here are unmet needs, here are our mitigation needs, and here are the program priorities for us. Here's where we think that North Carolinians in the western part of the state most need these funds, and how we're going to spend these funds to get back to pre-disaster recovery times. HUD has to review that action plan, which they've done, and they've said, okay, thumbs up. Now our grantee is entering a grant agreement with the state, and they're finalizing all those program policies and procedures that are outlined in the action plan. That's where we are right now. So we're sort of right here in the process. One of the programs has already been sort of up and running, but the other programs are still being designed, and you'll kind of get a better idea of what I mean in a couple slides. After this, you're going to be eligible to apply for funding from the grantee for these programs we're going to cover today. Then you're going to implement the program and deal with some of those compliance requirements. There'll be monitoring and reporting because you're going to be a subrecipient of the state, and then we're going to work on closing out the grant. That's sort of the overall process and where we stand today. In that action plan, the state identified certain funding priorities. And again, they did the mitigation needs assessment and the recovery unmet needs assessment. And they said, okay, we're going to direct our funding priorities at housing recovery, infrastructure, and commercial district revitalization. There's some administrative costs here, but here's how we're going to kind of divvy up the funds. 1 billion of the 1.4 billion is going to go to housing. So you can see that housing is the biggest priority for the state as far as recovery. Under housing, there are 3 programs that are separate types of programs that can help bring back new and restore housing for impacted areas. Then we have infrastructure programs. That's $193 million of our total for infrastructure. And then commercial district revitalization is $111 million for recovery. The slide sort of takes those programs and lays them out in a different way. You can see that housing has 3 programs: the reconstruction and rehabilitation for ownership or owner-occupied units program, the workforce housing for ownership program, and the multifamily construction program. That's our housing buckets. That's how we're going to divvy up that $1 billion between these 3 programs. Then we have our community infrastructure program. That's going to help fund infrastructure projects to help communities become more resilient and restore infrastructure, and our commercial district revitalization program related to economic development. We're going to go through each of these programs in detail today so you have a better idea of what the program requirements are allowed, or the overview of the program requirements. But before we jump into these 5 programs, let's talk about who is allowed to apply for this funding and where some of these most impacted areas have been identified. In the action plan that the state developed, they have to outline what they consider the most impacted areas, the most impacted and distressed areas. They're called mid areas. 80% of the funds have to be spent in what HUD has identified as a mid area. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development has said, we think, we did our own analysis, here's the most impacted and distressed areas. The state also did its own analysis and said, okay, we agree, and we're going to add some other state identified mid areas to the analysis here. Under the HUD identified mid areas, you can see that Caldwell, Cleveland, Madison, and Polk have little asterisks by them. That's because initially HUD only identified certain zip codes of those counties as being mid areas, but the state came in and said, we're going to actually declare the entire county as being disaster impacted. And because of that, they get to be counted as HUD identified mid counties, even though initially HUD only identified zip codes. So if you're in one of those counties today, you are considered part of the HUD identified mid area. Again, 80% of the allocation has to be spent in one of those HUD identified mid areas. The other 20% can be spent in the state identified mid area. And when we're talking about both of these together, we call them the combined mid area. So it means it could be spent in the state or the HUD identified mid areas. We're talking about the whole project. All right. CDBG-DR can be thought of sort of like a puzzle. You have to put the pieces of the puzzle together to make sure we're meeting all the compliance requirements. So all projects must tie back to the disaster. What does that mean? That means CDBG-DR funded programs have to address a direct or indirect impact of the disaster. A direct impact is usually something related to physical damage from the storm, like wind or flooding. But indirect impacts are a little bit less tangible. They typically refer to consequences of a disaster that are not caused by the immediate physical effects, but instead result from a secondary or longer term consequence of the disaster. So they're sort of more tangential impacts, consequences. We're going to look at some examples on the next slide. All projects have to also meet a CDBG national objective. These are the same national objectives that the CDBG program promotes. So if you have CDBG monies, you're familiar with the national objectives. And that means the funds have to benefit lower moderate income persons. 70% of the funds have to meet this objective. They might be able to be spent to prevent or eliminate slums or blight, but that's rarely used in disaster recovery funds. So that's your least common objective, or address an urgent need. And then the third piece of this puzzle is you must make sure you're spending the funds on an eligible use. So the eligible uses are outlined by HUD. They're also going to be fleshed out even farther by the Department of Commerce as they develop these programs. They're going to really hone in on what the eligible use is at the state level. And you also have to apply with state law when you're deciding whether a project is eligible. So let's dive a little bit deeper into our first puzzle piece, tie back to the disaster. What does that actually mean? Again, the North Carolina Department of Commerce is going to determine the very specific tieback requirements for each of the programs we're going to dive into. But at a high level, I want you to start thinking about, how do I meet this tieback requirement more generally? So if you have a direct impact, direct damage from the storm, maybe it's physical damage to housing or physical damage to infrastructure that was clearly caused by Helene, you're going to have to document physical loss. And those documents can include damage and rebuilding estimates, insurance loss reports, images, and including similar information that documents the damage. So just be thinking about, we're going to need to have documentation of the damage, which I'm sure many of you already do because you have the FEMA PA funds, but make sure you keep those documents for this next round of funding. Examples of some indirect impacts, we're looking at each of our areas. Housing, maybe you lost some affordable housing stock because of impacts from the storm. Increased homelessness because of displacement. So you'd want to think about how to document that connection, and maybe a post-disaster housing analysis that describes the activities necessary to address the post-disaster housing needs would be completed. If you have infrastructure projects, maybe you have strained infrastructures now. If you had an increased population in an unaffected neighborhood that caused a 40% increase in wastewater inflows, you might have to document, okay, we have now more population because people moved here and our wastewater structure is suffering. That's an indirect impact. Or commercial district revitalization, we have job loss in the area. We're going to have to document the data about job loss or business closing data and how that's different than pre-disaster data. Just think about how you're going to document and tie your projects back to the disaster. It doesn't have to be super, super strict and tailored. Again, the state's going to design specific tieback requirements, but it's pretty broad. If you can link the project to the disaster in some way, that should satisfy this requirement. And we're going to meet the national objective. We have to spend the money to benefit low and moderate income persons, and I'm going to dive into what that means in the next slide. But again, 70% of the funds have to be spent on this objective. Prevention of slums or blight, rarely used, but they are activities aimed at revitalizing areas or buildings with clear physical deterioration. They're not part of the LIM benefit, so they won't be falling under the LIM objective number 1, those projects. And then also meeting the urgent need. So these are activities that alleviate conditions created by and related to the declared disaster that don't meet the LIM objective, and the existing conditions must pose a serious and immediate threat to the health or welfare of the community. The conditions are of a recent origin, so they have to have occurred from the date of disaster forward. And then the grantee is unable to finance the activity on its own or through other funding sources. So you don't have enough money to meet this recovery need. So you need to bring the CDBG funds to fill that funding gap. Right, we're going to look at the LIM one in a little bit more detail. So we're going to talk a lot about how you meet the low and moderate income national objective, and there are different ways to do this. I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but I think it's important to have a high level understanding of how you can meet the LIM national objective. So one way to do it is through housing. And again, $1 billion of these dollars are going to be spent on housing initiatives. So meeting the LIM national objective through the housing method is probably going to be the most common objective that you use. So housing activities that are undertaken for the purpose of providing or improving permanent residential structure to be occupied by low and moderate income households. As long as you're building a household structure or providing housing for low and moderate income households, you've met that national objective. Another option is the area benefit. And that's where you undertake a project that's going to benefit all the residents in the area, not just a specific group. And that area has 51%, at least 51% of people living there, part of the LIM population. So maybe you're going to acquire land to be used in a neighborhood park in an area that's designated to have at least 51% low IM incomes, or construction of a health clinic or community center, or improvements of public infrastructure. They have to be projects that can be taken advantage of by the entire area, not just a specific group of people, unlike the limited clientele objective, which is the next one, which is 51% of the beneficiaries have to be low and moderate income persons. That means that the activity has to either benefit what we call a population that's presumed to be low and moderate income. So if you're undertaking a project to benefit the elderly or severely disabled or homeless, abused children, victims of domestic violence, and migrant farm workers, these are the populations that are presumed to be low and moderate income. So any activity that helps the elderly, that's going to fall under the limited clientele exception. You can also have projects that are specific to meeting income eligibility requirements, or be in such a location or such a nation that can be concluded that the clientele is probably who's going to benefit is primarily low and moderate income persons. So, for example, if you had a daycare center designed to serve residents of a public housing complex that's right next to the public housing complex, it can be assumed that this daycare center is going to serve low and moderate income persons. The last LIM objective is jobs. So if you undertake an activity with these funds that creates jobs, helps to create or retain jobs for low and moderate income persons, then you will be under the jobs category. And that means at least 51% of the jobs supported by that project or program that you've undertaken have to be held by or made available to low and moderate income people. How do you determine what constitutes as low and moderate income in your area? The easiest way I know how to do it is to do a Google search. If you Google search the Office of Policy Development and Research income limits, you're going to be taken to a website where you can plug in your jurisdiction. You can search by county under North Carolina, and it will bring you up a chart that shows you the income limits for the LIM determination. These income thresholds are based on Section 8 housing limits. So I pulled up Buncombe County. Asheville came up when you did that. And it says here, if you had a lower moderate income family which is 80% or below the LIM, if you have people in your family of number 4, or 4 persons are in your family, $74,500 is that household income. So you kind of look at your chart and decide where you are along those lines based on specific areas, and you'll get your determination of what constitutes low and moderate income for your household benefits. I also put this specific web link down on this slide in case you need to make sure you're in the right place. So here's what we've covered so far and how I want you to think about approaching the projects. You're going to ask yourself a series of questions to make sure you're getting all those puzzle pieces we had a few slides ago met. You're going to say eligibility. Is this project an eligible housing, infrastructure, or economic revitalization project? Location. Is the project located in one of those HUD-identified mid areas? That's where 80% of the funds have to be spent. But if it's not, is it in at least a state-identified mid area? You want to make sure you're in one of the mid areas. How are we going to tie this back to the disaster? Yes. How does this program or activity address a direct or indirect impact of Hurricane Helene? And how do we meet this national objective requirement? Does the project meet the LIM objective? That's the first question to ask yourself, because remember, 70% of the funds have to be spent to benefit this national objective. And if it doesn't, can we meet one of the other national objectives? Are we meeting the urgent need national objective? Is this damage directly related to the Helene disaster? And if not, unlikely that you're going to be on this objective, but you might have the slums or blight national objective satisfied. We're going to think through each one of these questions every time you're undertaking a new project or program or thinking about proposing one. You're going to see this flowchart several times throughout the presentation because we're going to talk about how to think through different projects using this flowchart. As we talked about earlier, we got sort of two buckets of funds. We got the regular CDBG-DR disaster recovery funds to help fund unmet recovery needs, and then we got a bunch of mitigation funds to help implement mitigation activities to limit the effects of future disasters. So when you're spending these mitigation funds, the requirements for these are a little bit different. First of all, the activity has to meet the definition of a mitigation activity, and those are activities that increase resilience to future disasters and reduce or eliminate the long-term risk of loss of life, injury, damage, loss of property, suffering, and hardship. That's a pretty broad definition. So really any activity that increases resilience to future disasters. They have to address current and future risks as identified in the mitigation needs assessment. So your mitigation activities are going to tie back to that state action plan where they set forth the mitigation needs assessment and where we really have our biggest mitigation needs. It has to be eligible project or program, and you also have to meet a national objective. The one thing to note here is you don't have to tie back your mitigation spending to the disaster. So there's no tieback requirement to a direct or indirect impact of the disaster, because it can kind of be assumed that your mitigation funds are going to be used just to make sure that you're more resilient to future disasters. So it doesn't necessarily have to tie back to the former disaster. Some common mitigation activities are going to include elevating homes or buildings in the flood-prone areas, rebuilding or repairing houses using resilient materials that are designed to withstand high winds or flooding or fire, relocating public infrastructure out of floodplains, improving bridges and roads to withstand high flood levels. This is a big one. We're going to spend a lot of our money on mitigation to improve bridges and roads in North Carolina. Supporting broadband communication systems to improve disaster response recovery also would work. This is not an exclusive list, just an example of typical mitigation activities. But when you are building a structure with CDBG-DR funds, you have to take some sort of mitigation actions. So let's talk about our housing programs. Remember, we have 3 categories of projects that are eligible. We're going to dive into housing, and within housing, there are 3 specific programs that the state has identified that local government that can be where we can spend these funds to support recovery. So housing programs generally can be used to support, these funds can be used to support the costs for new construction. And that is different than the CDBG program. So if you spend CDBG block grant funds, new construction costs are not allowed with those funds. You're allowed to do rehab and rehabilitate structures under the CDBG program, but not new construction. So here's one of the differences in those 2 programs. You can also do reconstruction, rehabilitation of damaged properties. There's the CDBG-DR program allows for home ownership assistance, buyouts, and rental assistance. You have to incorporate mitigation members when carrying out these activities to construct, reconstruct, or rehabilitate residential or non-residential buildings. So whenever you're doing a construction project for residential or non-residential structure, you're going to think about mitigation activities. And then again, the state is determining this program-specific eligible housing activities for the Helene disaster recovery. But our first program that the state has given the thumbs up to is called the Residential Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Program. This is the cornerstone project of the CDBG-DR program right now. It is where most of the funding is going to be spent. So the total funding for this particular program is $807,677,000 $677 million of just the general funding and $130 million of mitigation funds. This one's interesting because it's not a program that's open to local governments to apply. So you're not allowed to go out and apply for any of this program's funding. It is specifically designed for homeowners that had homes damaged in Helene to apply for funding so that they can have the house constructed or reconstructed with the funds. So the state is going to be administering this program, and they have hired contractors to help reconstruct the programs, and individual homeowners are going to be the ones who are eligible to apply for these funds to help reconstruct their homes. It's going to be a phased application process. So the application process is tiered such that priority is given to very low and low income individuals or households, with the highest prioritization for households with incomes less than 60% of the AIM. So these really low income families are going to get priority for the first round of these funds. And then phase two is going to increase if you fall within the 60 to 80% AIM, then the application period is going to open up for those homeowners. There's going to be a reimbursement. So if you incurred costs before this program opens and you have below the 80% AIM, that's going to be phase three. And then phase four is the last one. It's going to be individuals with income between 80 and 120% of the AIM. They're going to get last priority, and they have to qualify under that category as meeting the urgent need national objective. So again, what local governments can do with this program is get the word out. So they can say to homeowners that they know who have been impacted by Helene and have had storm damage to their homes or need their homes to be reconstructed, say, hey, there's this funding that's going to be available and you can apply for it. And it's going to help rebuild your residential structure. And the assistance cap is $375,000 per homeowner. There's certain prohibited uses, like you can't force someone to pay off their mortgage. You can't give them compensation payments or temporary housing assistance benefits, including mortgage and rental assistance or reconstruction of a housing in a floodway. There's a four-step process. Right now, eligible applicants can apply. Their application is going to be reviewed. Their site's going to be determined whether it's eligible. If so, they can have a contract awarded and signed, and then there'll be pre-construction and construction phases. The intake centers where these people who are interested in the program can go apply are located in Buncombe, Marion, and Boone counties. There's a little map to show you where those intake centers are. And the state contacts for further questions for this program are listed on the slide. So you can email the state contacts at the Department of Commerce and with any kind of follow-up questions. Maggie or Samantha would be happy to help answer any questions about this program. This is the only program I'm highlighting today that local governments are ineligible to apply for. So it's one to flag for in your mind, say we can direct homeowners to this program, but we cannot apply for the first housing program. All right, then we have the Workforce Housing for Ownership Program. This is the second housing program, and this one is open to local governments. And the focus of this program is on increasing the number of affordable housing units for purchase by low and moderate income households. Purchase is key here. The low and moderate income households need to be able to buy the structures to fall under this program. The goal of this program is really to help retain the workforce in Western North Carolina. We don't want people to have mass exodus from a workforce perspective after a disaster event. And it's becoming harder for people working in sectors like education, healthcare, public services, tourism to afford housing. So we want to help retain the workforce by making affordable housing available to the workforce within Western North Carolina. Workforce households are defined as households earning equal to or less than 80% of the AMI. So you have to be a sort of in the workforce. That way the essential workers in the Helene impacted areas are able to apply for and purchase these homes. So there is $53 million available for this program. The state is working to develop the specific program guidelines. They're going to announce a competitive funding announcement with application instructions and how they're going to score you and timeline details soon. So they're developing the project with all the specific requirements. What we do know at a high level here for this program is that eligible applicants do include local governments, but also include private and public nonprofit organizations, community development housing organizations, and community-based development organizations. The award amounts are going to be between $2 and $5 million. There's going to be probably just one application round sometime in 2026. Again, that timeline will be announced. Beneficiaries have to have that 80% or below AMI located in one of the mid areas, and developers have to be able to price those units to be affordable to the low and moderate income households. 100% of these funds have to be expended or will be expended for units to be purchased by qualifying households in the combined mid areas. So 100% of funds are going to these construction or rehabilitation of the residential units for purchase. And I have Missy's contact information below. She is the contact at the state for this program. We're thinking about doing the workforce housing program. We want to go through our flow chart. Is the project we're proposing going to fund the construction or reconstructions of homes for purchase by qualifying LMI persons? You're under this workforce housing, it has to be homes for purchase. Is the project located in one of the HUD mid areas or the state identified mid areas? How is this project going to tie back to the disaster? It's going to be an indirect impact. You're going to have an indirect tie back here because you're constructing housing units. And does the program meet the LIM objective? So you have to meet the LIM household objective. Again, these housing units need to be available to persons at or below the 80% AIM. If you can answer all of these questions affirmatively, document your tieback, you should be good to go to proceed to apply for that program or project you have in mind. All right, our third housing project, so our last and final housing project that CDBG funds can be spent on is what we call the multifamily construction and repair program. And that total funding is $191 million. 19 million of that is mitigation funds. And this program is going to be focused on the construction, rehabilitation, or reconstruction of rental housing. So our last program was about housing for purchase. This one is about constructing multifamily housing that's going to be rental housing. There are two tiers to this project. There are going to be small projects, that's 7 or fewer units, or larger multifamily projects, 8 or more units. The NC Department of Commerce is still working to develop this program guidelines, and they will be releasing all their criteria soon. But what we do know is that for the small project program, individual property owners can apply for this one. The award amounts are between $250 and $1.5 million. So for constructing multifamily housing, that's 7 or fewer rental units. The tenants who are going to occupy these units have to have income levels at or below the 80% AIM. Eligible projects are small scale developments, either new construction or rehabilitation of buildings containing up to 7 rental units. So again, we're rehabbing or constructing multifamily small unit rental housing. Now we're in the large project piece, so units 8 or more, multifamily units of 8 or more. This program is available to local governments to apply for, so you can apply for funding for larger construction projects. The award amount is between $500 and $15 million. There are going to be multiple application periods over the next several years. We don't know when those dates are going to be. Those are still being determined, but it has been confirmed there are going to be multiple rounds to apply for this funding. And the beneficiaries have to have an income at or below 80% of the AIM. And the location for these projects, the goal is going to get them into the combined mid areas, with more of a preference in the HUD mid area, but the state mid areas are also available to apply. There's going to be some additional consideration given to projects that are going to take place in difficult development areas, those are geographic areas or zip codes that are part of the low-income housing tax credit program. You don't have to have a tax credit associated with this program to be qualified, but the area is going to get extra preference, as well as areas that are considered qualified census tracts. And a QCT is where your households have incomes greater than or below 50% of the area median income, or poverty rate of 25%. So the goal is to really bring residential rental housing to those who are most in need from a low and moderate income perspective. A couple things to keep in mind. If you have buildings with 5 or more rental units, you have to provide broadband access unless you get a waiver. The funds are often used in conjunction with other funding, such as the HOME program. HUD operates another block grant program called HOME, and you can combine these funds together. There's affordable rent limits that's established by HOME. So you have to have a certain rental cap to make it considered affordable to the persons who are going to occupy the rental property. And then that affordability program lasts for 20 years for new construction. There is a shorter period of affordability for those rehabilitation projects. But if the new construction, 20 years has to be how long these units have to be made available to the lower or moderate income persons. So this is a very interesting program. I think local governments really need to consider how they're going to move forward with multifamily construction projects for rental housing, because there's a great need for rental housing, and you have the opportunity here to get a really big chunk of money and possibly combine it with other federal dollars to make a big impact on your affordable housing issues in your local jurisdictions. So now we're out of the housing area. We talked about our 3 programs. 2 of them, one's for home ownership, the workforce housing, and the second one's for rental housing, multifamily rental housing. Let's walk through our final questions if we were going to undertake this rental housing project. Is the project to fund construction or reconstruction of rental housing? Is it eligible? Are we located in one of our eligible areas? How are we going to tie this back to the indirect impact of the disaster? And does the program serve the LIM household? Are you going to meet that AIM 80% requirement? If so, you could probably move forward with that residential housing project. All right, we're going to move into our other category of eligible projects, and that is the Community Infrastructure Program. So this is the 4th of the 5 programs that the state has authorized in the action plan. Again, 3 of them were for housing. Now we're in infrastructure. And the state did a lot of analysis about infrastructure needs when it was doing the action plan, when it went out and said, okay, where are our most impacted areas, and what are the real impacts that Helene had on infrastructure? And in the action plan, it outlines what the state identified as the biggest issues. And I've listed those on the slides. I'm not going to read them to you, but overall, there's a big need for infrastructure repair for electric, gas, water, sewer, wastewater, telecommunications, roads, and bridges. We have a big unmet need for infrastructure. So this program was designed to give a significant opportunity to carry out strategic, high-impact, and innovative infrastructure activities to recover from the disaster and help mitigate future disaster risks. The infrastructure activities are giving you a unique opportunity to come in and say, we're going to take these federal funds, maybe combine them with other funds, and really dive into fixing some of our major infrastructure problems that have resulted because of Helene, and think about ways we can become more resilient in the future by implementing mitigation efforts into these infrastructure projects. So the infrastructure is a great way to think about future impacts and how we can make ourselves more resilient and enhance and sort of damage-proof our public infrastructure in your most impacted areas. You want to think about how you're going to restore critical access, how your infrastructure needs to support economic recovery and preventing future damage and resiliency. Some details about this program. It is $193 million that's going to be available. 18 million of that is going to be for mitigation. Program is available to local governments. You can apply in the combined mid areas. The funding amounts are going to be anywhere between $500,000 and $15 million for a specific project. So that's a good chunk of money to help meet those unmet recovery needs for an infrastructure project. You're going to have to think about your mitigation efforts ahead of time. When you apply for the project, you're going to need to identify what mitigation efforts you're going to put into this project. One of the prohibited projects I want to point out to you is the construction of emergency operation centers. And that's a centralized facility where the government officials, emergency managers, and support staff coordinate responses and recovery during disasters. So you're not allowed to undertake efforts to construct an emergency operation center under the infrastructure program. Certain projects are going to have sort of priority here. Projects with substantial amount of other funding available. I think the state's going to look at and say, okay, we're coming in to meet some unmet needs here, but maybe some FEMA public assistance funds have been already designated to this infrastructure project, but they're falling short. So we're going to come in with the DR funds and fill that unmet need. So they're going to look for your other funding sources here. How shovel ready are you? Have you already started a project because you have FEMA PA funding already underway, or did you get another federal grant? So really the project has started and the disaster recovery funds are just going to help you get to completion. Projects that provide a greater benefit to housing recovery. So maybe you're tying some of your infrastructure to a housing project, and we're going to look how those two connect in some examples. And then, of course, projects that serve higher areas with low and moderate income populations. The program director is Ayanna Wallace for this program. She's the person who kicked off our program this morning, and her contact information is here. So if you have any questions about the infrastructure program, you're welcome to contact her. Let's talk about some eligible infrastructure projects because there are a lot of them. There's a whole slew of eligible projects. I've listed them on the slide, but you will need to think about what does it mean? Just because you say water resources project, what do you really do with that project? Or what is a stormwater and sewer project going to look like? Some projects that you might want to consider are because surface transportation projects are eligible, including roadways, bridges, and railroads. Maybe you want to undertake a railway project and repair and stabilize damaged rail bridge and track infrastructure in your community that was damaged during Helene. All right, stormwater's allowed. Well, what are we going to do with that money if you want to take a stormwater project? Maybe you're going to replace drainage culverts or make pump station replacements or repair stormwater outfalls. What are you going to actually do with the money once you have the project? Broadband and telecommunications. There's a lot of damage to broadband infrastructure. So you can install fiber optic cables, construct wireless towers. There's stream-based stabilization projects or landfill repairs. I know a lot of landfills had damage or have become overly full, or maybe you need to relocate them. That would be an eligible infrastructure project. And there are going to be a lot of wastewater treatment projects like sewer line installation and repair, manhole replacement, lift station repairs, and treatment plant construction or expansion. These are just a couple of ideas. I want you to always think about, let's look at my list of eligible projects and then think, what can we actually expand that list and what are we going to do with that money once we undertake the project? So for our infrastructure projects, we're going to make sure that the project is eligible. It's in our identified location, a HUD identified mid area or a state mid area. There's a tie back to the disaster. You still have to tie back your infrastructure project to a direct or indirect impact of the disaster. We have to meet a national objective. Does it meet an LIM objective? Is the area basis is a big one for infrastructure projects. If you can say that the area that you're going to benefit with this infrastructure project is going to benefit an area where at least 51% of the persons are low and moderate income, you've met that area basis LIM objective. Thinking all the way back to the beginning of our presentation where we talked about how to meet the LIM objective, area basis comes into play a lot with infrastructure projects. If you don't meet the LIM objective, can this project possibly meet an urgent need or eliminate slums or blight? There are different types of infrastructure projects. Some are like more utility based. You can also use these infrastructure funds to construct public facilities. And one of our examples talks about how you can use infrastructure funds for the construction of public buildings and public facilities. So you think about different types of infrastructure projects and how you're going to tie them back to the disaster and make sure that they're meeting our national objective. I'm going to skip this slide. I think it's going to get us too much into the weeds, and I meant to take it out before I did this. All right, our fourth project is, or our fifth project, sorry. Now we're in the Commercial District Revitalization Program. So the last way that the state has said we can spend these funds is to help revitalize commercial districts. What's a commercial district? The state is going to work to define exactly what a commercial district means, but the goal is to help revitalize areas that are what's considered economic drivers that have been impacted by Hurricane Helene. It doesn't necessarily have to be a downtown area, just an area that is an economic driver for your community. And you might have more knowledge about where the specific areas that are considered economic drivers of your communities exist. And you will want to work with the state to make sure you are gearing your projects to the areas that are allowed and that are economic drivers within your community. At a high level, the eligible projects and programs for this revitalization program will include the acquisition, demolition, site preparation or rehab of commercial structures. So you're allowed to update commercial structures or rehab them. Mixed use projects involving commercial revitalization and housing components. So any kind of mixed use housing project in a commercial district could be eligible, and general facade improvements to private or public structures in commercial areas in those economic driver areas. So is $111 million available for this program. Local governments are eligible to apply, and the funding amounts are going to go from $500,000 to $10 million. I just went through all of the eligible activities, but some project examples could be downtown Wi-Fi, park upgrades, sidewalk installations, greenways, facade improvements, mixed-use developments, and streetscapes. Again, all in the areas that are considered economic drivers. If you have questions about this program, Emily Quinlan is the program director for the state, and she knows all the details about this program and also is helping to develop the program requirements. And she would be happy to answer any questions you have about the Commercial District Revitalization Program. So we've covered our housing, our infrastructure, and our Commercial District Revitalization programs at a high level. You know, the funding amounts, you know, which programs you're eligible to apply for, you know, generally the types of activities that are going to be considered eligible and how we're going to need to tie them back to low and moderate income populations, households, and areas. Let's think now about what you can do with this money from a project perspective. We're going to look at specific project examples about how you might combine this funding. How can we combine an infrastructure project with a housing project? Or how do we combine a commercial district revitalization project to also help meet the low and moderate income housing needs or housing project? What are people doing with this money? How has this money been spent? We're going to dive into some examples here. So our first one, we're going to look at our workforce housing program. That's going back. That's our second housing program. Local governments are eligible to apply, and it's constructing workforce housing to retain the workforce in Western North Carolina, and the housing has to be available for purchase by low and moderate income persons. So let's say we're having a project for constructing workforce housing, and maybe we want to tie it to an infrastructure project. What does that look like? Maybe you're going to construct 20 workforce housing units in a low and moderate income neighborhood. We want to make sure we think about how we're going to implement mitigation measures into those houses, because that's required. You have to make sure you take mitigation steps when you're doing a construction of any building. So maybe the units are constructed to meet current building standards and include elevation and flood-proofing measures to reduce future risks. And then in the surrounding area, we might undertake an infrastructure project by upgrading the stormwater and drainage systems, elevating roads, installing new sanitary and sewer lines to reduce backflow in homes during the storms. So that's an example of a workforce housing and supported by infrastructure project. Maybe you want to undertake a multifamily rental housing project. That's our third housing project we discussed today, all about constructing rental housing. So you can maybe have construction of a new 60-unit multifamily rental complex, and then think about how you're going to upgrade the infrastructure around that housing complex to help support. Water and sewer lines are an option. Road improvements, again. Installation of a lift station to handle increased wastewater volume. Maybe green infrastructure features such as permeable pavement, anything to manage stormwater runoff or reduce flooding risks would help benefit this property. The infrastructure benefits the housing and is an eligible infrastructure project all around. It would help mitigate future damages for future storms. Another possible project, and this one has been done all over the country, it's fairly common now with CDBG-DR funds, is a multifamily rental housing unit for senior living redevelopment. So often abandoned structures have been taken, like abandoned hospitals, and they're turned into senior living centers so that you can help use these monies to upgrade and rehabilitate any kind of abandoned structure and then make it a senior living facility. So this particular project example, the project transforms a long-term abandoned hospital into a 40-unit affordable senior living housing facility serving low and moderate income residents. And you want to make sure you do the hazard mitigation measures, such as elevating systems, installing flood blends, implementing a backup power generator into this structure. That would all count as hazard mitigation. Maybe there's going to be some infrastructure component to this project, like adding water and sewer lines, installing ADA compliant sidewalks. It's a senior living, you would want to think a lot about ADA compliance and how to make the building more accessible. And then stormwater drainage improvements to reduce localized flooding risks. This picture on the slide is actually a former hospital that was rehabilitated with CDBG-DR monies for senior living. So I saw the before and after pictures. It was amazing what they did. And it looks like a lovely senior living redevelopment project that has been very successful. Another type of infrastructure project is the construction or rehabilitation of public facilities. Public facilities are defined by HUD in 24 CFR 570-201, and they include construction of a community center, a senior center, sometimes resource centers, homeless shelters, health centers. So we talked earlier about how infrastructure is not just going to be utilities. It can also be the construction of public buildings. These are examples of public buildings that would be considered eligible for construction under the infrastructure category. You can do a combination. A lot of times they'll have a community center that can also serve as an emergency shelter during emergency situations, or a resource center that can serve as an emergency shelter. You would want to make sure you would install specific sort of mitigation efforts, especially backup generators if this is going to be one of your emergency shelter locations. But I don't want you to think infrastructure has to be on the ground infrastructure, broadband infrastructure. It can be, this money can be used for the construction of certain eligible public facilities. So, keeping in mind that the public facilities need to benefit low and moderate income persons, tie back to the disaster impact, and support community resilience. So we can't just construct a community center in an area that doesn't have at least 51% low and moderate income persons. That eligibility requirement still applies. We have to still make sure we're always benefiting low and moderate income persons. So at least 70% of the money has to be spent under that national objective. All right, our last example, just a basic infrastructure project that involves park and greenway reconstruction restoration. You've had a lot of damages to your parks and your greenways. And so you can use these funds to help restore damaged parks and greenways. Maybe you could even come up with a new park or a new greenway, especially if it was in a downtown area that's an economic revitalization project. All right, we're gonna have our second poll here, and then we're getting close to wrapping up. So hang with me for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we should be finished. This poll is, which program area are of greatest interest based on your jurisdiction's unmet needs recovery? Housing, infrastructure, commercial district revitalization, or unsure, or all of the above? right? It's looking like about 50% of you on the call are saying all of the above, which makes sense because you have so many needs to meet, so many unmet recovery needs still. And infrastructure is coming in pretty strong second. So when you're thinking about spending these funds, you do want to think about how to combine the projects like we just showed you. So you can do a housing and infrastructure project together. And when you're in that all of the above category, it's going to be really important that you think strategically how to design these projects. So you're meeting all of these sort of category needs and helping promote recovery across those areas. I'm going to end this poll. You can see the results here. I saw a raised hand, but I'm not sure that you're able to unmute and ask a question in this webinar. But you can put it into the chat and they will be able to answer it for you. All right, a couple key considerations, some things to take away when we're not talking about specifically about the types of projects that are allowed, but just more broadly program requirements. I'm sure many of you have heard about environmental reviews. You're probably familiar with this from your FEMA public assistance. Because with FEMA, you're also required to do environmental reviews for those projects. So environmental reviews come into play here with HUD as well. They have their own environmental review process. Keeping in mind that you have to have the environmental review process complete before your funds are committed or spent. That's really important, particularly if you've not started a project. So we don't want you to come in here and think, okay, we have a project underway. Maybe we have a project that's partially supported with FEMA public assistance funds, and we want to use CDBG-DR funds to come in and help meet the rest of the project needs. That's okay. You've been authorized by FEMA to move forward with that project, and you probably have had that environmental review completed and accepted by FEMA, which would be the right way to go about it. HUD would still have to approve the project, and the state would have to approve that the environmental review done by FEMA satisfies the HUD and state requirements here. But if you haven't started your project, you don't want to start one until the project has passed the environmental review process. If you have started a project with FEMA, you could maybe use your FEMA environmental review, but that has to be checked off by HUD and the state first. So either way, don't really move forward unless you get certification that either you've met the environmental review process because you've done it with FEMA funds and HUD's on board and the state's on board for the CDBG piece, or wait until the state completes the environmental review if you haven't started the project at all. So the state is going to determine the environmental review process for each project type. They're going to be very specific requirements tied to each of the projects. The overall goal is to ensure that the projects using federal funds don't negatively impact the environment and that you're complying with all applicable environmental laws like floodplain management, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water, Clean Air Act. We just want to make sure we're not damaging the environment with these projects and we're all complying with all the federal laws regarding environmental areas. So again, if you haven't started a project, we want to make sure that you don't move dirt, you don't acquire property, and don't hire engineers to design a project yet. Your project still needs to be going through the environmental review process before you should take those kind of steps. If you have already started a project using other federal funding, we're going to make sure that that environmental review process satisfies HUD before you do anything else. The goal here is to avoid what we call choice limiting actions. You don't want to do anything before a project starts that might impact your ability to pass that environmental review process. And the choice limiting actions include committing HUD funds, CDBG-DR funds, or non-HUD funds before the project has started, or physically altering a property before you've passed that environmental review process. So HUD regulations require that there's no physical or financial commitment to a project to be made until the environmental review is completed. And HUD has issued a release of funds, finding that there's going to be no significant environmental impact. If you don't wait, it's going to be problematic because HUD may not allow for reimbursement for project costs, and you could have to possibly repay the funds. Again, that's if you're in that not started project category here. So key takeaway from this slide, more to come from the state about what's going to be involved in the environmental review process for different project types. And if you haven't started the project, don't start it yet. You need to make sure you satisfy the environmental review process and get the thumbs up, and then you can move forward. And unfortunately, this can be a slow process. It can slow down infrastructure projects, but it's required by law. So you cannot skip the environmental review process, or there could be repercussions for your funding. Another thing with the HUD grant or with the CDBG-DR grant to keep in mind is that there's what they call the duplication of benefits requirement. So you're not allowed to have the disaster recovery funds supplant another funding source. So if you have enough funding for a project, you can't say I'm gonna plug in DR funds and take out my FEMA public assistance funds. CDBG-DR funds have to come in and backfill to meet that unmet recovery need, where we have a hole in our budget and say we are short by $300,000. We have all this other funding, but we're still short. That's where CDBG-DR can come in and plug the hole. The state is going to perform the duplication of benefits analysis for all the submitted grant applications. So they're going to look at your project that you're proposing and look at your other funding sources and make sure that there's an unmet recovery need that still exists for which the disaster recovery funds come in and plug that hole. So again, the funds can't supplant other funding sources. You need to make sure that you have the relevant documentation on hand to show how a project is funded. So when the state comes in and does their duplication of benefit analysis for that project, it's able to say, okay, you put $2 million of FEMA public assistance, you got a loan here for this piece of the funding, insurance covered this much of the project, bringing together all the funding sources for a specific project you applied for, and then you should be able to say, and here's our unmet need. This is a big one. You definitely do not want to move forward by supporting projects with the disaster recovery funds if you already had another source of income or several sources of funding that covered the total cost of the project. Procurement is going to be a big one. We're not going to dive into procurement requirements today, but keep in mind that federal procurement is going to apply. So when you're spending these funds and hiring contractors, you have to procure everything according to the Uniform Guidance Procurement requirements. And those are set forth in the Code of Federal Regulations, or the 200-317 or through 200-327. Many of you might be familiar with the federal procurement if you spent some of the ARPA funds. Big takeaway here today for procurement compliance tips is that the uniform guidance precludes contractors and firms that develop contracts or specs of work or statements of work, invitations for bids, or requests for proposals. So contractors that help develop the project specs cannot then go around and turn and apply for that project. They can't comply to be the contractor for the project if they developed the entire project. So make sure when you get to the phase where you're actually wanting to bid out the project to contractors that contractor did not develop this, the scope of that project for you. Again, something that's unique that's not under state law is that service contracts have to be competitively bid. That's not a state law requirement, but you do have to bid out service contracts. And we have a lot more training to come. My colleague, Krista Kukuro at the School of Government, she focuses entirely on procurement, state and federal procurement, and she knows all about federal procurement requirements and state procurement requirements. She would be happy to answer any of your questions that come up between now and future trainings, or even after future trainings when you're moving through the procurement process. Her email is on this slide. And we will definitely be diving much more into detail about procurement in our upcoming training sessions. One thing you want to keep in mind here is that when you're spending federal funds, you have to have a written federal procurement policy. So if you don't already have written federal procurement policy in place, that could be something you think about doing. So what can we do now to prepare? We're bringing this all together. We've told you there's a lot more information to come on specific project requirements. But from a where are we now standpoint, you can start thinking about how to project plan. You can conduct needs assessments to identify and prioritize your unmet recovery needs. I know many of you in that last poll just said all the areas are of interest to us. You're going to have to start sort of, narrowing down really what is the crux of the projects that you want to undertake with these disaster recovery funds. What are our top priorities here? And maybe you need to go out into the community and do some research. Maybe look at all your other projects that are being supported by other sources of funding and say, okay, we're going to be able to cover all the costs for those projects, but we're going to fall short here. And that's what the DR funds are available for. So we're going to really prioritize these sections because we know we need more money for that. You can start thinking about project locations. Again, don't buy land, don't move dirt, but like where should these projects happen at a high level? Think about how you're going to align the project to that disaster tieback. You're going to have to always meet that tieback requirement. Think about mitigation efforts for a specific project. Confirm the project meets the national objective requirement. Make sure you're meeting the 70% being spent in low and moderate income objective, and that 80% are going to be spent in the HUD identified mid areas. Coordinate efforts and communicate with stakeholders. Coordination is key. A lot of times, local governments might say, we're going to do this housing project, or we're going to do this redevelopment project. Well, the next town over might be doing the same thing, or you might have a nonprofit that wants to get involved in the project. So go out and talk to your nonprofits, talk to coordinating communities. Maybe you want to do a rail repair infrastructure project. Get the next community over involved, because the rail tracks might run through multiple, counties. You can work together, make sure you're planning those projects that are going to benefit the most areas, the most low and moderate income populations, and don't just get into a silo where you're thinking we're in this alone. The storm impacted a wide area, and you can coordinate to make sure your disaster recovery works well for all of the vicinity. Also, you want to start thinking ahead about your administrative planning. Applying for a CDBG-DR grant-funded project is a lot of work. These applications are thick. I saw an example. One of the COG directors let me see an application, and I was like, wow, this is an involved process. So you want to think about who is going to be the best person at your jurisdiction to sort of think through, how do we apply for the project? Do we have that capacity here? Are we going to need technical assistance? Many of you are going to need technical assistance needs. Maybe you're going to need to rely on your COGs to help you with these application processes. Think about drafting and revising policies to reflect the federal rules. Do we have our procurement policy in place I just discussed? Do we have our federal conflict of interest policy? You should all have that because it was required from the ARPA award. Just make sure you can identify it and put your hands on it, and that your governing board members are reminded about the federal conflict of interest rules as well. Again, you want to establish those clear roles and responsibilities. There should be someone in charge of the grant management, overseeing how the funding is spent and following up on projects and identifying which projects you want to pursue and which ones are less pressing. Your financial management systems have to be tailored to be able to track grant funds. You're going to have to be able to know how you've obligated funds, when you've expended funds, which projects have been expended on. Do you have receipts for everything? Do you have also the supporting documentation? You need to put systems in place to make sure you're going to meet all those requirements, and your financial management system can accurately track how you've expended these grant funds. If you don't have any system in place to track grant fund expenditures, definitely get that ball rolling now. And you're going to need internal controls over expenditures of grant funds. That's required by the federal uniform guidance. And that just means think about how you're going to segregate your duties. Don't just give one person total control of all your federal grant funds and say, good luck, we hope you spend it on eligible projects. There should be some kind of checks and balance in place to make sure multiple people are overseeing how these federal grant funds are spent, how we're documenting things, how are we making sure that we can find the documentation later for reporting purposes. Do we have policies and procedures in place? That's part of your internal control processes. And really making sure we've dotted all of our I's, crossed all of our T's to know how we're spending the funds, where the funds are being spent, and that there's accountability and oversight by multiple people in your jurisdiction. So that's kind of where we are now. What can we do to prepare? We're really waiting now for the state, which I know that they're getting close, to come out with those specific program requirements. And once that ball has been rolling, you're going to jump quickly into the application phase. That's coming up soon. So just really start thinking about your projects and thinking about your financial management systems and how those are going to be implemented. Okay, we have our last and final poll. You guys hung with me for a long time today. We are about to wrap up with one more poll question. Here it is. What is your jurisdiction's primary concern when it comes to pursuing CDBG-DR funding? Project planning, administrative support, post-award compliance, or all of the above? All right. Looks like all of the above is coming in with winning with about 70%. Project planning and post-award compliance are close second. Administrative support seems to be the least concerning one. See if I can share those results. And it makes sense, all of the above, because all of these are big categories, right? It's hard to plan a project. It's hard to think about how you're going to administratively support that project and how we're going to guarantee that we've complied with all those federal rules and regulations. We're here to help you with that. That's sort of the goal of this program and the future training programs, is that we want to be involved. You have partners who are ready, willing, able, and excited to help you navigate this process. And that includes the School of Government, the League of Municipalities, the North Carolina Association of County Commissioners, and your contacts at the North Carolina Department of Commerce. We're going to do our best to bring relevant trainings to you and help you stay on track. And your COGS are going to play a key role in this as well. But we are hoping to put the infrastructure in place to make sure that all of you have the opportunity to undertake projects with this money and expend it in a lawful manner. So thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a better understanding of the CDBG-DR program. Again, follow up with any of us for questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Ayanna if she has any follow-up closing announcements from the Department of Commerce.
Yes, thank you so very much, Rebecca. If there are any additional questions, please drop them in the chat. And there will be a formal Q&A document that will go out to all participants of this session. In addition, there will be some additional resources that go out. The state DCR is looking to create a project profile for all potential projects. That link will also be a part of the email that goes out with the Q&A document, along with some links to some other videos that potential applicants can watch that have been created by HUD to help you understand what the requirements are. And again, there will be 2 more sessions. The next 2 will be in person. They will be hosted in your areas in collaboration with your local COGS. The dates and the registration links will be sent out this week. During those times, we will be talking more in depth about all of those requirements, those high-level requirements that were mentioned today in a more project specific approach. That is going to be the importance of you completing the link so that as we are coming out for face-to-face and planning technical assistance sessions, we have an idea of what your immediate needs are. Again, please drop any questions in the link. We want to make sure that all of the questions are addressed. We want to make sure that we are walking hand in hand with you all as we go through this very big process of getting you grant ready. Again, thank you all for being present. I hope that the information was useful, and you will be receiving the email with the appropriate links and resources, dates, and registration times for the face-to-face sessions. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining us.